This is episode 153 of That Shakespeare Life. Today's episode is brought to you by Experience Shakespeare. Experience Shakespeare is the membership arm of That Shakespeare Life that offers you monthly digital history activity kits that let you try at home the history you learn about on the show. They work like science labs for history. Stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Philippa Lacey-Bruhl of British History Tours. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
He used nag a lot, but not specifically Galloway Nag. So it's worth saying right at the start that nag isn't being rude. It's just a name for a horse in Scotland. And in the case of the Galloway Nag, it means an exceptionally good kind of horse.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
In Henry IV, Part 2, Shakespeare writes what has long been considered the earliest known reference to a Galloway nag when Pistol says, quote, "Know we not Galloway nags?" That comes from Act 2, Scene 4. If you're not a 16th century Scotsman, however, that assumption that you know what a Galloway nag is or why it's suitable for Pistol in that scene may not be as obvious as the character suggests. It turns out that in the 16th century, a Galloway nag was a highly reputable horse from the Galloway region of Scotland. The term Galloway nag is still used in parts of Scotland, England, and Australia to describe a horse of smaller stature that is fast, reliable, and what we would call an easy keeper here in the US. During Shakespeare's lifetime, the Galloway nag was a source of contention between England and Scotland because they weren't united until the coronation of James I in 1603. As our guest this week writes about in her publication, From North to South, the Galloway Nag as an elite gift in the 16th century. Prior to the unification of England and Scotland, border laws were enacted to try and stop the trade of horses entirely, not just to Scotland, but to anywhere from leaving England without a particular license. By the time James comes to the throne when Shakespeare is 39 years old, the Galloway Nag is sought after all along the Irish Sea, as well as into the islands and coasts of Scotland and down to the coast of Cumbria, with a strong reputation as a highly valuable, reliable, and trustworthy steed that people were going to get their hands on no matter what the laws said. Here today to share her research into the Galloway Nag and to present evidence of a reference to them that predates Shakespeare's use of Galloway Nag in Henry IV, Part 2, is our guest, Miriam Bibby. Miriam Bibby gained her BA Joint Honours degree in Archaeology and Geography, specializing in British prehistory at the University of Nottingham. Obtaining her Master of Philosophy in 2000 on the topic of the horse in ancient Egypt, that year Miriam also founded Ancient Egypt magazine and edited the magazine for 4 years. She has curated and worked on various museum projects with the Manchester Museum, the Clan Armstrong Trust Museum, Beamish Museum, and Gilnockie Tower. She has also worked in heritage management, being responsible for the delivery of 2 historic trails in southwest Scotland, the Eskdale Prehistoric Trail and the Border Revier Trail. Her work has been published in numerous journals and magazines, and she has presented at many conferences and day schools. She is former editor of the equestrian magazine Hoofprint and was involved at senior regional level in endurance riding in the 1980s. She is currently completing her PhD at the University of Glasgow on the influence of the Galloway horse and is a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. Miriam is co-editor of the newly launched international journal Chiron, which focuses on equine and equestrian history. Find links to Miriam's work as well as more information on these journals in the show notes for today's episode. Hello, Miriam. Welcome to the show.
It's good to be here, Cassidy. Thanks for inviting me. What a pleasure to talk about one of my favourite animals, the Galloway Nag.
I'm excited to hear about it myself. I'm curious about this term, Galloway Nag, used by the Scottish and the English together, or was this an English term? Where did the phrase Galloway Nag come from?
That's an interesting one. So far, most of the time, I've got it in use on the English side of the border by English people. That's not exclusively the case. Certainly in Scotland, they used to use different terms. They used Powny, a form of pony. That in itself may be a Scots term. Used Sheltie for both a pony and a Shetland pony. And they used simply horse. So you don't really come across them. And they used nag. They used nag a lot, but not specifically Galloway nag. So it's worth saying right at the start that nag isn't being rude. It's just a name for a horse in Scotland. In the case of the Galloway nag, it means an exceptionally good kind of horse. It's from a verb which simply means to neigh. So there's nothing awful about it, though we've come to use it to mean like an old nag. That's a different etymology. That's from a Scandinavian word meaning to nag at somebody, to gnaw away at them and to be very awful. So for somebody to call you a nag is actually not an insult at all. And if somebody called me a Galloway nag, I'd be very happy.
It'd be a compliment for sure.
It would be a compliment, yes. Because the Scots had a term, to nag awa, to nag away, which doesn't mean to nag at somebody. It means to ride at a smooth, steady, comfortable pace, because their horses, their nags, were renowned for being smooth and comfortable and horses. But on the English side, yes, that's where you come across it. Where I'm from, in Newcastle on Tyne, in North East England, we still use the term. It's a live term. So if somebody in Newcastle were to say to me, that's a canny Gallower, I would know exactly what they meant. They'd mean, that's a really nice horse. I like that horse. But in Scotland, I see it mainly turning up much later on than the 16th and 17th centuries. You see it in the work of Walter Scott, for instance. He uses the term Galloway, but I certainly have come across it much more in English, on the English side of the border.
Well, what do they look like physically? Explain for us, if we were to see a Galloway nag, what would it look like?
That too is a very interesting one, because technically they were extinct before the great days of photography arrived, and there's a whole backstory to that. They aren't really extinct because their closest relatives are the fell ponies and Dales ponies of northern England, and also there's a strong DNA link to the Highland ponies. So there's very little evidence for the Galloway nag in terms of skeletal remains. There's nothing in museums and nothing in the way of drawings. I don't have them here to show, but I do have a very good description from the 19th century, and I'll read that if that's okay. It's from a man called William Ewart, who wrote a lot about agricultural matters, horses, animal breeds. He was very famous, and then his works ran to many editions. So he said, a horse between 13 and 14 hands in height is called a Galloway, from a beautiful breed of little horses once found in the south of Scotland on the shore of the Solway Firth, but now sadly degenerated and almost lost through the attempts of the farmer to obtain a larger kind and better adapted for the purposes of agriculture. There is a tradition in that country that the breed is of Spanish extraction, some horses having escaped from one of the vessels of the Grand Armada that was wrecked on the neighbouring coast. This district, however, so early as the time of Edward I, supplied that monarch with a great number of horses. The pure Galloway was said to be nearly 14 hands high, so they're not really tall horses, but they are tall ponies, and sometimes more, of a bright bay or brown, with black legs, small head and neck, and peculiarly deep and clean legs. Its qualities were speed, stoutness, and sure-footedness over a very rugged and mountainous country. Now, the first thing I have to say is that that's a very romantic picture of the Galloway. And the stuff about the Spanish Armada, I'm afraid, is quite simply not true, because a Scottish historian with an interest in other Scottish breeds discovered that there were no horses on the ships of the Spanish Armada, no cavalry horses, no, not of that type. There were pack animals and there were mules, and they were mostly lost overboard in the storm. So this romantic tale does resurface, but I'm afraid it's not true. But they do have a reputation, certainly by the 19th century, of being this rather romantic, beautiful kind of horse. But the endurance and speed, yes, we know about from much earlier times, from Shakespeare's day, effectively. The speed and endurance qualities are certainly there, and they're mentioned by some well-known people that we'll be talking about a bit later on, like Malcolm and the Duke of Newcastle. Yeah, so very attractive and very easy to keep. That was the other thing that was always said about them. They weren't expensive. They were easy to keep on rough ground, basically.
So were they illegal to have in England prior to James I?
This too is a very interesting question. That again dates back to the days of Edward I trying to conquer Scotland. And on the border between England and Scotland, there were in existence border laws specific to that area, which is something that Edward I really was a thorn in his side, that on what he considered to be his territory in England, there could be a set of laws that weren't English laws. So from that time onwards, there was certainly legislation of one kind or another over the years in place to stop horses being exported either way, basically. And the laws which particularly are of interest to us, given this time period, Shakespeare's day, start about 1495 under Henry VII, who banned effectively the export of any horses from England into Scotland or anywhere else without a special license from the king. And Henry VIII brought in a new law in 1530 saying, well, that law doesn't seem to be working because there's horses going all over the place and I've got no control over it. So I'm going to bring in an even stronger law that says you can't take horses into Scotland. This was finally repealed in James's day, but only after he'd united the crowns effectively, 3 years after 1603. So prior to that, technically, it wouldn't be legal. But in practice, there was an awful lot of trading and various business going on. And especially on the border, which was divided on both the English and Scottish side into wardenries of the three marches. I don't know if you've come across those at all, but you had the English West, Middle and East March, and you had the Scottish West, Middle and East March, each one with its own warden. And they basically look after the border law using juries of 6 Scots and 6 Englishmen. They've got their own little code of business. And they're all interested in horses, both for raiding, for riding, and also for racing. So I think it's pretty hard to imagine that there weren't horses crossing the border one way or the other, certainly. Yeah. I think that they were kind of, fiddling the rules when they needed to. And they were all chums.
As James I was trying to unify England and Scotland under this banner of British, there was significant resistance on all sides, not just for the trade of horses, but all kinds of resistance. And Miriam writes that, quote, between the two nations was this border, which was viewed by the elite in a similar way to the region of Galloway as a remote, mostly upland area, a place on the margins of civility, end quote. Miriam, you've mentioned the marches and this border laws being kind of its own area, but if Galloway as a location was viewed with, let's say, skepticism in terms of the value they produced, why was the Galloway Nag from this area given this kind of reputation of being so highly prized? Why wasn't it seen as a kind of riffraff, I guess?
There is a sort of ambivalent attitude to it. Whenever the Galloway Nag turns up in a reference, you find that there's a bit of sort of humour goes with it. But I'm not in any doubt that people saw it as a quality horse. What this tells me is that breeders in Galloway knew a good horse. They knew what they thought was a good horse, and they knew how to produce them. This basically comes back to where horses came from and how people acquired horses. And one of the things that was true, not just for Britain, but also right throughout Europe, was that there were semi-feral herds of pony-sized equines going back. We've got documentation of this, certainly going back to medieval times and even further back, probably, but we don't know so much about it. So these were like a local resources almost, and they would run pretty freely, and people would just acquire one when they needed to have a horse. They would be improved, is the term, basically, by stallions that were owned by local monasteries, the local aristocracy. They put to either turn out horses, so their stallions with the stock to run, or they could acquire horses and breed them and produce the kind of horses they wanted. Medieval horse breeding was very, very practical. It was, what does your horse do? They were called after what they did. So you have a courser, it's a fast horse. You have a destrier, it's a knight's horse. They had different functions. It's a very functional kind of thing. The concept of breeds only comes in much later on. So Galloway was one of the places, like uplands in Wales and Exmoor and Dartmoor, where there were semi-feral herds of ponies. We still have them in the UK. We've got Fell and Exmoor and Dartmoor and New Forest ponies that still live that kind of semi-feral existence. as a resource. Galloway was one of those places, but we don't have them there anymore. They've gone. It's a great loss to our tradition. That's because not only were did they go out of fashion, but also a lot of them were used in creating the Clydesdale breed. So it was Galloway mares, and at one point, the big Clydesdale, the working horses, they were bred to larger stallions. And at one point, it was actually called the Galloway Clydesdale because there was so much Galloway in it. So, but we've lost the Galloway as one of our native ponies, while we still have many of the others. So it tells me that the people that were living in Galloway knew what the good types of horse were, and they knew how to produce them, and they knew how to get them to the people that needed them in the markets. The people who actually raise horses or look after horses, guard horses, living a semi-feral existence like that, they're not necessarily involved in the selling of them, or they sell them on to a market or to somebody's agent, say an aristocrat's agent. And it's only when they get into the aristocratic household that we're able to tell that these animals are there at all, because then they're given a name or they're recorded. Prior to that, years ago, there may be no record for them at all. But we do know that it was pretty much ordinary people, ordinary farmers, who were involved in the first stage of the trade. And of course, on the border, constant warfare going on, particularly in the 16th century. Horses, you need horses, definitely. And they knew what they were doing in Galloway.
Miriam writes about the earliest reference to the Galloway Nag being the reference Pistol uses in Shakespeare's Henry IV, Part 2, but points out that one other contemporary to Shakespeare, Thomas Dekker, also tells us about the cultural place of the Galloway Nag when she says, quote, Thomas Dekker's satirical how-to manual for the Young London Blade, the Gull's Hornbook, published in 1609, recommends the Galloway Nag as a mount for a fashionable young man, end quote. Miriam, is Dekker being serious here in recommending the nag, or making a joke, perhaps about smuggling?
I think he's being absolutely serious about the quality of the Galloway Nag, but his work is a satirical handbook, a satirical guide. A hornbook was usually a religious book in a frame with very thin horn put over the front of it so that you could see through it, like they used to use that in windows as well. It was their equivalent of glass. Right from the start, he's playing around with words and usages. But the Gull's Hornbook, gulling is tricking somebody. It's like a confidence trick. If you gull someone, if you read the rogues literature of the period, which is really, really fascinating, there were all sorts of different ways to trick people out of money or goods, or just basically all sorts of trickery going on. Dekker was one of the authors that was involved in this kind of description. So you gull someone, you trick them. Or you can be a gull, that means you were tricked. So this whole handbook is about trickery, but who's tricking who? So in that sense, I think we have to be cautious when we're reading it as to where the trickery is going on. And the fascinating thing is that some of those tricks are still alive and well, and they've just been upgraded for the internet age. You can still see them using the same methods. But this handbook is about young men, where to go, what to wear, what to do, how to do it, who to be seen with. You can imagine it being very, very easily upgraded for the 21st century. But instead of horses, we'd have cars. Cars would replace the horse. The description that's of relevance to us, if you don't mind me just reading that, is first, having diligently inquired out an ordinary, which is a type of eating house inn, of the largest reckoning, whither most of your courtly gallants do resort, let it be your use to repair thither some half hour after 11. Don't get there too early, whatever you do. You'll be all on your own. Nobody will be there. For then you shall find most of your fashion mongers planted in the room waiting for meat. Ride thither upon your Galloway nag or your Spanish jennet, a swift ambling pace, in your hosen doublet, gilt rapier and poniard bestowed in their places, and your French lackey carrying your cloak and running before you, or rather in a coach. For that will hide you from the basilisk eyes of your creditors and outrun a whole kennel of bitter-mouthed sergeants. These are young men that are getting into trouble all the time, basically. And the horses that they want to ride, he puts the Galloway nag first, and the Spanish jennet that we know for a fact was a very popular, high-quality, high-class horse of the time. but he puts the Galloway Nag before that. So that tells me that the Galloway Nag is probably very fashionable at this point. He's having a bit of a dig at the people who find it fashionable. It might even be that we're supposed to compare the two, that the Galloway Nag's what you ride if you're looking for trouble. If you're looking for a fight, you ride a tough little street nag. And if you're going on a date or you're going to try and get money out of someone or you want to look your best, perhaps it's your Spanish jennet that you mount instead of your Galloway Nag. There are subtleties, so many subtleties here that, of course, we can't get the detail of anymore, but we can see it in modern terms. You can really see what's going on. These young men are going from, tavern to bordello to playhouse, and they're causing trouble at every step of the way, and they've got to have the right clothes and the right horse to go with it.
So we've associated the Galloway Nag with being the reliable horse you'll want if you're in a scrape somewhere. But were they associated also with racing? Were they good at being fast? You mentioned their speed earlier.
Yes, very good. They turn up in the very early records of racing. Prior to the foundation of the thoroughbred, Galloway racing was very popular. A lot of people know about some of the stories of the later development of the thoroughbred, the three so-called founding fathers, Darley Arabian, the Godolphin Arabian, and the Bailey Turk. But there was a whole organised form of racing before that. It started as early as the 1500s, where people are having races which are matches, generally between different horses, and they're run over different heats. And the winner gets a silver or gold bell or a silver or gold plate. They're very important things. And we do know that Galloways were still, the term Galloway was being used right into the foundation of the general stud book in the 18th and 19th centuries. But we don't know quite what it means genetically. That's one of the issues. But we know that in the early days, Galloways were fast. They were used for racing. And recent DNA research has shown that it was mostly likely that the speed gene came from a Galloway mare, rather an unknown Galloway mare. We know the names of so many horses that have created horse breeds, but we don't know the names of some of the early ones. But the Galloway, the Irish hobby, yes, they were the first race horses, if you like, and provided some of the foundation material for the thoroughbred and some of the critical material for the thoroughbred, the speed, Mm-hmm. And the Galloway races still went on.
In her work, Miriam writes about one account that gives Galloway Nags a specific reputation for reliability. She writes, quote, "The Galloway came in for special praise from Markham, who spoke well of it in his Complete Horseman of 1607 as not short of the best nags that are bred in any country whatsoever. For soundness in body, they exceed the most races that are extant, as daily experience shows in their continual travelings, journeyings, and forehuntings," end quote. Miriam, does Markham's Galloway reference indicate that Englishmen were buying and selling horses on an international marketplace during Shakespeare's lifetime for these qualities? Were they that valued that they were risking the laws and everything to buy and trade them?
That's a very interesting point, actually, because what's happening is in medieval times, as I said, we have this focus on function. It's what horses do. It's not where they're from or what they're called. But certainly from late in Elizabeth's reign, from, say, 1560 onwards, which is I think was the publication of Blunderbier's first book on horses and horse types, you're starting to see a new approach coming in, which is, where does that horse come from? What type of that horse is that horse as named by place? So is that a Spanish horse? Is that a French horse? Is that an Italian horse? Is that a Neapolitan horse, which is a very good war horse? And as the world begins to open up and you start to have a global market in all sorts of things, so too does the horse market begin to open up and begin to get prototype breeds and people identifying the different qualities of horses from different places. And it's worth just stressing again that as a Scottish animal, the Galloway Nag is as foreign to the English as any other horses. It's not like seen as an English product, so to speak. So we get one or two kind of very conservative commentators saying, "Oh, you don't want to be buying all these foreign horses. What you want is good English horses. The English are very good at raising horses. Why are we buying all these foreign ones?" And you get people starting to have anxieties about differences and different qualities, just as they're having anxiety about different people that are so strange, they consider as being so strange and different from them. But horse breeders are an interesting bunch because basically they're very pragmatic people. They breed, buy and sell horses based on what the market wants. So if the young men of London are having a phase where they want to buy nags, Galloway Nags will be very popular and people will breed horses of that type. So they're very pragmatic, much more pragmatic than the people that were having these sort of worries and concerns about this whole new world, this whole new globe opening up. They just saw them as opportunities for improving their horses and producing new kinds of horse.
We've mentioned that general scholarship does consider the earliest reference to the Galloway Nag to be from Shakespeare's Henry IV, Part 2. However, Miriam's work suggests that conclusion may have been arrived at in part because the Scottish side of the history of Galloway Nags has gone overlooked. In her work, she cited specifically the correspondence between Patrick Adamson, Archbishop of St. Andrews, Scotland, and John Whitgift, Archbishop of Canterbury in England in 1583. Miriam, what did you find in the correspondence between these two men that might predate Shakespeare's reference to the Galloway Nag?
That was very interesting. I suppose that first, before we go on to that, perhaps it'd be useful to look at the Shakespearean reference and just what that was, because everybody thought that was the first reference to Galloway Nags for a very long time. And it's pistol, probably called ancient pistol. I always see him as being a bit like, I don't know if you know the TV series Blackadder. He's a bit like Baldric to Sir John Falstaff's Blackadder, He's kind of the sidekick. Who's a bit of a problem, really. But on this occasion, they're in the tavern and Pistol's just about to be thrown out because he's being troublesome. And Dole says, thrust him downstairs. I've had enough of him, kind of thing. And he goes, thrust him downstairs? No, we're not Galloway Nags. And he's obviously like revving up for a fight. He's probably got his fists clenched and he's ready to punch somebody, So he compares himself to this tough little Galloway Nag. That used to be sort of bang, there's the Galloway Nag, all of a sudden on the pages of history with pistol. And he also says, he just says this thing about these jades of Asia that are so weak. So he's actually kind of making a comment on foreign horse breeds, basically, and associating himself with this thing. But that was fortunate enough to discover a piece by Gordon Donaldson's son, a Scottish scholar, who had looked at this correspondence that went on between Patrick Adamson, these two very, very important churchmen at a very critical point in the church during the Reformation, and the Scottish Reformation was particularly intense. These are both Episcopalian bishops, obviously, and they are in correspondence with one another, tentatively trying to create a relationship between England and Scotland that will endure basically through Elizabeth's reign and afterwards. So Patrick Adamson comes down from St. Andrews in Scotland riding comfortable ambling nags, because that's what you ride, and he's not a very well man. And he spends time in London with Archbishop Whitgift, who had lots of horses. He used to ride in and out of places with a huge train of people on horses behind him. He was notorious for this. And while in London, for some reason, Adamson gives his horses away, and he has to borrow one from Whitgift to ride back. And he says, well, lend me a horse to go home on, and I'll send you a better one, a Galloway Nag. So, and he also offers a Galloway Nag to Walsingham as the one of the most important men in England. So we can see that this is an elite gift, and this, of course, is another way that horses have always been exchanged. Whatever the rules are, if you're wealthy enough, if you're important enough, you can buck the rules, basically. But here we have these two very important churchmen trying to create a future where England and Scotland, in terms of religion, will be in harmony, even if whatever else happens. And I think they've got an inkling, of course, that it will be James VI then first, who will be James VI of Scotland, who will become James I of England. And they need to smooth the ground. So the Galloway Nag here, in this instance, is very important politically and socially to the future of the relationship between the two countries.
The writings of these two men and the lives of these two bishops came even closer to Shakespeare's life, because in 1599, the Archbishop of Canterbury, John Whitgift, and the Bishop of London, Richard Bancroft, would issue a ban on all satire in England that impacts the theatre industry and playwriting of the time. And then the same John Whitgift is the man who signed the marriage license for William Shakespeare to marry his wife, the then Anne Whatley of Temple Grafton. The written correspondence between Whitgift and Adamson includes this discussion of Galloway Nags and may have had a personal connection for Shakespeare. Miriam, is it possible the reference by Pistol in Henry IV Part 2 to the Galloway Nag specifically is a satirical reference to the Adamson-Whitgift meeting, the ban on satire, and kind of an in-joke among industry playwrights when Shakespeare wrote it?
I believe that it is an in-joke, because you see it turning up not just in Shakespeare, but also in Dekker and also later in Jonson. Now, obviously, I am, I suppose, what's called a hedgehog researcher in this instance, because I'm looking for references to the Galloway Nag, and there are a lot of them. So I really have to make the most of what there is. And I see this little cluster in amongst the playwrights. Now, of course, around that, there's a huge world of their jokes, their in-jokes, their satirical comments. But what I focus in and what I try to get the most from is the Galloway Nag reference. And it seems to me there is a little in-joke there going on between this group who all knew each other, who all fell in and out with one another, that it has a meaning, an in-joke for them. And of course, with Whitgift being, as Bishop of Worcester, he had signed the marriage document for Shakespeare and his wife Anne. So they knew about them. He knew about Whitgift as on a personal level. When the ban on satire came in, it has been suggested that this was actually a boon for, because that was a sort of written satires, a boon for the playhouses, because satire could continue in plays. Effectively, it sort of took over. I've read a couple of scholars suggest that. So that in itself is interesting, and that again picks up with Ben Jonson later on and his use of the term Galloway Nag. I believe that, yeah, it was one of the in-jokes of the time, one among many, basically, but with that strange personal edge for Shakespeare, yeah.
In her work, Miriam cites the Galloway Nag as a potential connection point for attaching one of Shakespeare's contemporaries, Ben Jonson, to espionage. Miriam, how do Jonson's Scottish heritage and his use of the term Galloway Nag indicate he may have been targeted by William Cecil for work as a spy?
Ben Jonson is a very interesting character. His grandfather was Scottish, from Annandale, but he was very much a Londoner, very much part of the capital, very much part of that group of playwrights. Now, one thing that was interesting when James VI first came to the United Crowns is that suddenly people start going to Scotland. They start walking to Scotland. And one of the people who walked to Scotland to visit a poet called William Drummond was Ben Jonson. So he actually spends time in Scotland. It's possible that this was just a visit because there were several other people doing walks at that point. But it's also possible that there was some espionage behind it. This would certainly be the case later on with Daniel Defoe, who went to Scotland, who was paid for by Lord Harley at the time of the political union. So it's a bit hard to tell whether he was or wasn't. I've come across both interpretations. But he spent time with William Drummond, who was a kind of Scottish court poet, so to speak. He wrote a poem called Fourth Feasting about James VI I's only return visit to Scotland, around the time that Ben Jonson was in Scotland. And Ben Jonson's use of the term Galloway Nag in his play Bartholomew Fair, I am convinced is a direct satirical dig at James. Now, Jonson was obviously sometimes in trouble with the authorities because he ended up in jail at one point. And he's a funny character because he was writing court masques, so he was writing for the court at the same time as he was doing satirical plays on the stage. But in Bartholomew Play, which is a really fast-moving play with lots of action, lots of people coming and going, lots of characters from all over the country in it, lots of voices, a character called Northern, who is a clothier, walks onto the stage, and he is met by a dodgy horse dealer called Knockham, They've obviously been carousing together, and Knockham's obviously been trying to get some money out of him. But the northern, the clothier, walks on, he goes, oh, he's been drinking, he's I'll never, the ale's too mighty. Now, this is a joke that people in England and Scotland will recognise today, because even today it's considered that the beer and ale in the north of England and Scotland is better than the beer and ale in the south, which is awfully expensive and not very good quality. But, that's it. So this in-joke still carries on to this day. So here we have the northern, the clothier. And at the time, James was involved in a very tricky scandal almost over cloth. So I think that Ben Jonson whips this kind of satirical dig at the king in very quickly. Knockham says, he says, how now, my Galloway nag, the staggers, which is an ailment that horses have, and he comes up with this kind of remedy where he's going to cut him in the head and he's going to stick pepper and all sorts of things into it and fix it. But it's a dig at James for not an English dig from a man of Scottish ancestry about Scottish incompetence, basically. That's what I believe the Galloway Nag reference in Bartholomew Fair to be. And he was lucky that he's in there under in jail for that one, I think.
I think he narrowly escaped, yeah. I know we would love to learn more about the Galloway Nag. This is very exciting. What are some of your favorite books and resources that you can recommend we use when we want to learn more about these horses?
Well, anybody with an interest generally in horses in the period should get a copy of Professor Peter Edwards. Can you see that okay? The Horse Trade of Tudor and Stuart England. It's very good. Obviously, it's about England, and he uses the toll books, which was a way of ensuring that the right horses were being sold to the right people. They were records, basically, kept at horse fairs. Now, it's specifically England, but there's an awful lot of very useful material about Scotland in there too. So that's a very good one. Now, one of my favourites, and his sources are excellent. One of my other favourites is Anthony Dent, Horses in Shakespeare's England. Anthony Dent was a big fan of the Galloway, so you'll find material about the Galloway in there. He is a little bit annoying because he tends not to use bibliographies and references, whereas Peter Edwards' references bibliography are immaculate. So, but nonetheless, Anthony Dent is a very, very entertaining read and has a lot of fun things to say about horses in Shakespeare. And I've done a couple of papers on the Galloway Nag. There's not a lot out there. It's kind of a bit of a lost animal, the Galloway, but I'm trying to stop it being a lost animal and bring it back into view again.
Which we really appreciate, because now we get to know about this. And we will link to both of these books that Miriam recommends, as well as Miriam's papers that you can read too, which are great resources for learning more about this horse and how it fits in with Shakespeare's history. So make sure you check out the show notes to find links to those. Miriam, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
The complete works of Shakespeare and the Bible are brilliant, actually, to any researcher, and to a researcher with an interest in the horse, they're super interesting because there's lots of references to horses in them. So I'd have a field day with those two books from the very beginning. They'd be excellent. Now, for my own book, this is so hard because it's so my favourite books. But the one I tend to return to is a book called The Master and Margarita by a Russian author called Mikhail Bulgakov. And this is a marvellous kind of book with lots of devilish, anarchic goings on, with a sort of demon cat called Behemoth, who is very entertaining. It's a very fast and funny book, but it's not just that. It combines politics and philosophy and the supernatural, witches and all sorts of things in what's a fantastic ride that just carries you along. So I guess it's a bit like the Galloway, that it's a fast, smooth ride and you just go along with it and all these devilish goings on and really enjoy it. There aren't really any horses in it until towards the end, when there's a beautiful supernatural scene involving horses in this strange supernatural landscape. So it is a book I can read and reread and get right inside with characters. And I think given that I can only take one other book with me, it would have to be that one.
I think that's a wonderful choice, which we've never had mentioned on the show before. So we'll make sure to link to that one in the show notes as well. So you can read this beautiful supernatural story with the horses at the end. So what's next for you, Miriam? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Even as we speak, I'm just in the final phase of my PhD on the Galloway, which is exciting and relieving. And I hope to carry on and do more research on the Galloway. Yeah. Also, I'm very interested in horses in coal mining and horses in coal mining, because in the north of England, we used to call them ponies worked in mines. They were called pony gallowers or pit gallowers. It's one of the places where the name lived on. Some of them may have been real gallowers from southwest Scotland, and others might, it's just a name that's applied to them. So I'm interested in the history of coal mining. And I was lucky enough to work at a place called Beamish Museum, which is a big open air museum where there are, which kind of celebrates the industrial history of North East England and where there are horses. And I was lucky to work with the horses, including the pit ponies there. So I'd like to get into that side of it more and look at their role in coal mining. But a few papers due out as well, one of which will combine the supernatural and horses and various other things. And a recently completed project, if you don't mind a shameless plug.
Yes, please.
Is this one, which is The Materiality of the Horse with my co-editor, Brian G. Scott. And this is based on papers from the Leeds International Medieval Congress with Trident Publishing, and working on Trident on a few projects now as well, and editor of the new journal for Trident.
Well, that sounds fascinating. Congratulations on being almost finished with your PhD. We'll look forward to calling you Dr. Miriam Bibby from now on. Thank you so much for being here with us and sharing the history of the Galloway Nag. This is really exciting. And we will link to your book, The Materiality of the Horse, in the show notes for today as well. Thank you, Miriam, for being here.
Thank you very much for asking me. It's been fun. Anytime I can talk about the Galloway Nag, I love doing so.
Find links to more information on Miriam Bibby, her work into the Galloway Nag, as well as links to Henry IV Part 2, where you can read Pistol's reference to the Galloway Nag, along with all of the archival images and drawings we could find to tell you more about the places and the attributes of these beautiful horses. Find all of this packed into the show notes for today's episode at CassidyCash.com/episode 153. That's CassidyCash.com/EP153. Don't forget that the video version of today's episode is now streaming on our YouTube channel. You can find that at youtube.com/c/CassidyCash. And if you want to have all the video versions of our show, along with documentaries, animated plays, virtual tours, and more, be sure to check out the digital streaming app for That Shakespeare Life at CassidyCash.com/experience. That's CassidyCash.com/experience. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.